Midnight. No warning, no siren, no alert on your phone. Just the sky above Israel suddenly splitting open. A wave of silent light across the horizon, followed seconds later by hundreds of rolling explosions. But on the ground, the systems designed to protect them were silent. This wasn't a random barrage. It was a saturation tactic. Iranian cluster missiles splitting mid-air, releasing a storm of submunitions designed for one purpose: to overwhelm point defense architecture. And it worked. The system, engineered for single threats, catastrophically failed. And in that moment, the real mystery began. This wasn't just an intelligence failure, it was an engineering one. The attack wasn't just successful, it was perfectly calibrated to a weakness no one was supposed to know existed. That weakness wasn't in a single radar or battery. It sat inside the architecture of response itself. The system assumed a pause between shocks, a recovery window that would always open. Within hours, the picture proved that assumption false. The opening attack was not an isolated incident. It was the first move in a daily strike cycle Iran had scripted to drain Saudi, Gulf, US, and Israeli defenses of time cruise and interceptors. Iran's design was simple. Exploit that missing recovery window with a rotating 24-hour barrage. Morning, a strike hits Saudi oil facilities. Around noon, a barrage slams a base in Bahrain. Evening, assets in Qatar take the next hit. Near midnight, when crews are on their last shift and air defenses should be resetting, the wave shifts to Israel or a US position. This sequence didn't happen once. Over several days, Iran pushed more than 5 separate barrages inside single 24-hour windows, repeating the same exhaustion arc. That multi-wave schedule seals the window shut. There is no time to rotate batteries, reset air defense software, or push repair crews into the damage. Resources and interceptors aren't just strained, they are emptied out. The proof of concept was brutal. US bases in Iraq. Warehouses holding munitions and spare parts were gutted. Command structures and logistics compounds that tied the footprint together were taken offline. The building still stood on the map, but the base as a functioning node was gone. The war has moved faster than the response. Every institution that was supposed to contain it is now behind the curve. This engine of chaos, this engineered failure of response, is not new. To understand how dangerous this reality is, we have to go back to the last time a system broke this badly. Henry Kissinger's worst nightmare in 1973. That nightmare began in October 1973. On Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar, Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on Israel. The shock was brutal. Nearly a fifth of Israel's air force was gone within days. About 2,500 Israeli soldiers were dead, and ammunition was being burned so fast that commanders were counting how many days of shells and sorties they had left. For US Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, the operational picture was a catastrophe in motion. He was facing a two-front crisis, a possible military collapse for an ally, and an economic time bomb at home. Any move he made could trigger a worse catastrophe, step in hard, and risk a direct US-Soviet confrontation, or hold back and invite Arab escalation and the use of oil as a weapon against the West. Kissinger put that fear into one blunt line. My nightmare is a victory for either side. A decisive Arab victory would reorder power in the Middle East and tighten Arab oil leverage over Western economies that lived on their crude. A crushing Israeli victory would humiliate those same producers, wreck US credibility in Arab capitals, and from his perspective, make it likely they answered with coordinated embargoes and price hikes. In both branches, The architecture that kept oil flowing, superpowers deterred, and US alliances credible, was at risk of snapping. After days of watching the war deteriorate, the US finally launched a massive airlift of supplies to prevent Israel's total defeat. OPEC's retaliation was immediate, an oil embargo on the United States and its allies. The price of oil quadrupled, from $3 a barrel to $12, feeding into the 1973-1975 recession with high inflation and unemployment. For ordinary Americans, it showed up as gas lines, wrapping around blocks, and drivers waiting for hours just to get a partial fill. A surprise attack on a holy day had just proven that the choke points were not on the front lines, but in the energy system and price decisions that powered the global economy. And that sequence, from the first shots on Yom Kippur to the recession's full weight, took months to unfold. That embargo decision was the trigger then. Today, the trigger is Iraqi oil storage tanks hitting zero. The Doomsday Clock for Iraqi oil storage hitting zero isn't measured in weeks. It's measured in days. We have 6 days. That isn't a diplomatic deadline. It's a physical limit. Just as in 1973, when the OPEC embargo turned a local war into gas lines and rationing, the shooting has tripped an economic time bomb. Here's the operational picture. The Strait of Hormuz, the artery for about 20% of global oil, is effectively shut. Tankers sit idle in the Gulf, and the onshore tanks feeding those terminals are creeping toward full by the hour. If you can't ship, you have to store, and storage is finite. Early estimates still sounded manageable, around 20 days of spare capacity, then 15, then 10 as new data came in. The ambiguity ended when Baghdad's oil ministry issued its latest Basrah export update. They weren't talking about all Iraqi storage, only the remaining spare room in the onshore tanks feeding Basrah's berths. At current flow rates, that spare capacity is gone in about 6 days. That 6-day window, over 1.5 million barrels per day of Basrah exports with nowhere to go, is the economic doomsday clock. Saudi Arabia may have 60 to 73 days of cover, but with Hormuz closed, you can't instantly swap in those barrels. A chunk of that 20% artery simply goes dark. That's why the price path doesn't drift higher, it breaks. In JP Morgan and Bloomberg's stress runs on this setup, the move is a vertical spike, with crude punching toward the $200 per barrel zone. Picture a chart that grinds sideways and then goes straight up. An instantaneous market heart attack. At that level, pump prices, diesel, aviation and shipping costs all jump fast enough to crush margins, reignite inflation, and drag central banks toward tighter policy. There's no recovery window before portfolios take the hit, equities and credit get stress tested in real time. We've seen energy shocks before. If you queued in those 1970s gas lines or managed a business through the last spike, I want your read. Does this 6-day countdown feel different on the ground? Drop your experience below. It's field intelligence we need to navigate what comes next, because the economic shock is only the first symptom. The conflict is already metastasizing outward into a far more existential domain. The systems that keep civilians alive, starting with water. Here's the operational picture of that expansion. To the north, the conflict map bled across a new border into the Caucasus. Iran issued a direct military warning to Azerbaijan: expel all Israeli personnel. When Baku didn't move, drone strikes followed, hitting targets in the Nakhchivan enclave. Just like that, a former Soviet republic on Russia's southern flank was pulled into the war. This was no longer just a Middle Eastern theater you could manage with regional diplomacy. As that northern front opened, The fire was already jumping into the systems that keep Gulf cities alive. Cut the frame from the map to a strip of coastline and a clean, high-tech desalination plant. The war shifted domains, from territory to civilian survival infrastructure. After a US strike hit a civilian desalination facility on Iran's Qasem Island, Tehran didn't answer with matching damage. It went straight for existential leverage, issuing an explicit threat to seawater desalination plants across the Gulf. States like the UAE and Qatar rely on those plants for up to 99% of their potable water. These facilities are the lifeblood of millions. The Gulf Cooperation Council Desalination Network holds roughly half of the world's entire desalination capacity. The World Bank is blunt. Any significant disruption here is not an inconvenience. It becomes a humanitarian catastrophe within days. With almost no buffer, days of storage, not weeks, and almost no natural fresh water to fall back on. Once these plants are hit, there is no recovery window to build an alternative architecture. By putting them on the target list, the war formally turned civilian water infrastructure into a legitimate military objective. The threshold where a border conflict becomes a test of whether entire city-states can stay habitable. In the same phase of this crisis, the map widens into the Caucasus. Gulf desalination plants are on the target list, and the pressure jumps again into Europe's energy supply. Qatar sits at the center of that chain. It faces a direct threat to its water while hosting the largest US airbase in the region, so its liquefied natural gas exports are no longer just business. They are leverage. Doha reaches for the one lever Washington and Brussels cannot ignore. It announces a halt to all LNG shipments. With that, the single largest supplier of LNG to an already desperate Europe goes dark. When your largest supplier steps back, there is no quick substitute and no single policy lever that can refill that gap while also securing the Caucasus and the Gulf. For millions, the conflict is now in their homes. In the thermostat, they check when the temperature drops. The contagion arrived in an announcement from Doha. Qatar Energy halted all liquefied natural gas exports after missile strikes critically damaged its main hubs at Ras Laffan and May Said, severing a key artery of the global energy system. For Europe, this was not just bad news. It was the worst energy insecurity the continent had faced since the 1970s. After cutting itself off from Russian gas, Europe rebuilt its strategy around a few suppliers. Qatar was chief among them. That source, supplying between 6 and 12% of EU LNG, vanished overnight. Here's the operational picture. On the map, LNG routes from the Gulf to Europe go dark, while other exporters are locked into existing contracts and import terminals are already close to capacity. Spot prices surge, storage levels fall faster than planned, and there is no way to summon new cargoes before winter demand hits. In unheated Berlin stairwells, breath hangs in the air and assembly lines in the Ruhr shut down for lack of gas. Across European capitals, emergency cabinets meet at midnight as charts of subsidies, market stress, and alliance pledges share the same table. Leaders have drawn red lines and sold victory to their publics. As the system buckles and the pressure turns politically unbearable, one question surfaces. Why don't they just stop? By now, stopping the war is more dangerous for them than continuing. They are trapped in what military strategists call a political victory trap. The trap is built from promises. Words spoken to rally a nation that harden into a cage. Leaders on both sides have pledged absolute undefined goals. Former President Trump
vowing the enemy will cry uncle. Prime Minister Netanyahu promising Israel will hit very hard until the job is done, and will go to the end. These are declarations of total victory. Here's the operational picture. Defense analysts and former military planners broadly agree those goals are militarily and politically unrealistic. Phantoms no battlefield outcome can reach. On the ground, that means operations and deployments with no clear end state. Beyond the theatre, energy markets and shipping lanes, price in chronic instability, and defense postures and risk premia ratchet higher instead of normalizing. Once those words are out, compromise becomes radioactive at home. Propose a ceasefire or limited deal, and within hours domestic commentators call it surrender and voters read it as weakness. De-escalation, short of something sold as unconditional surrender, is treated as betrayal. This is the core of the victory trap. The conflict stops being about a defined rational end state and becomes about not losing face. Politically, there is no way to stop without admitting the promises were impossible, so escape routes close and the damage compounds. For you, that translates into time, not headlines. Years of elevated uncertainty and risk premia that never fully come off. No election cycle, no single policy tweak suddenly resets this architecture. So if the people making the promises have no map out of this trap, we stop waiting for theirs. This is the moment we stop watching their failed strategy and start executing our own. To do that, you need a different kind of map. And now you get it. So if leaders are trapped in a forever war, where does that leave those who have to navigate the consequences? There is a map. It has two primary layers: risk and opportunity. We track both to get the operational picture. On the risk side, the initial coordinated strikes trigger cascading effects. The market's first reaction gave us the baseline. Oil jumped $8 to $10 per barrel, with Brent near 80, and European natural gas spiked 39 to 50%. Moves like that are feedstock for sustained commodity volatility, and if they persist across quarters, embedded inflation. One channel runs through the real economy. Higher energy and input costs squeeze incomes and keep policy rates higher. The other runs through security strategy. Exposed vulnerabilities push governments into multi-year increases in defense budgets and procurement. Over those budget cycles, higher interest costs and heavier defense outlays compound strained fiscal positions, pushing bond yields up and lowering the ceiling on equity valuations. But the same shocks force adaptation. Systems rewire under stress. That is where asymmetry appears between fragile, import-dependent players and domestically anchored producers with buffers. The breakdown of global supply chains is not just a risk. It accelerates onshoring in critical sectors: semiconductors, defense manufacturing, batteries, critical minerals. Policy responses are visible too. Look at the US Strategic Petroleum Reserve. By February 2026, inventories had climbed to 415.4 million barrels, roughly a 15.6% increase from early 2024 lows. That is deliberate, rebuilding energy buffers after a drawdown, not a random fluctuation. Together, these shifts outline a near to medium-term window for repositioning. The next couple of years as budgets reset and reserves are rebuilt. The map points toward hedging systemic risk, not chasing headlines. Large-cap, diversified North American energy producers and midstream assets, pipelines and storage, are one obvious axis. They sit on domestic production chains and earn from volume and infrastructure, as well as price, so they are relatively buffered from regional shocks, even as they still move with global cycles. Inflation-linked bonds and other real assets form a second line of defense, directly tied to that inflation channel. A third bucket sits in select defense and industrial names with domestic supply chains and government-backed demand, aligned with the multi-year rearmament trend. Even mainstream platforms like E-Trade and Morningstar have begun nudging clients towards similar exposures. That's corroboration, not the reason for the trade. But after the capital is repositioned and the financial risk is hedged, this map has one final layer. A price that is never quoted on any exchange, only in the lives of the people who end up paying it. Because beyond the maps, the pricing screens, and the portfolio positions, there's one last layer. Every move we traced, midnight escalation, sanctions, energy reroutes, pushes stress down the system until it lands on real people. For us, it appears as spreads widening and supply routes blinking red. For them, it's heat shut off in winter, extra shifts to cover a blown wage, a deployment order in an ordinary mailbox. That is the price, and it isn't measured in dollars or barrels of oil, but in human lives. The people carrying that cost aren't the ones who sign the orders or draw the arrows on the map. They're soldiers, grid workers, truckers, families. At that layer, there is no hedge and no recovery window, and you should hold that in mind when you think about positioning. If this framework provided you with clarity, subscribe for more analysis that cuts through the noise. And share this map with a peer who needs to see it